Good morning. My name is Susan Klein, and I am the Region 7 Brownfields Coordinator here. I wanted to just give you a quick heads up here. Want to make sure if you're on this call that you are interested in the FY25 Brownfields Assessment Revolving Loan Fund and Cleanup Competition for EPA. And I think some other people have been joining us. Please be aware we are going to record this session, and we will post those recordings as soon as possible when we are completed here. So again, I'm Susan Klein with Region 7. A little rough start here, but now we can get going. So I have a couple of slides to run through, and then we'll get to the meat of today's discussion, which is really all about you all asking your questions that you might have left regarding the upcoming competition and getting your application submitted. So again, we're recording, we'll post this. We have not yet posted the other presentations. We do intend to do that in the near future here. We've been having a little bit of difficulty. When we do get those all posted, they will be available at the web page you see here.
Yeah, I don't know that one. Yeah.
Andrew, let's mute you. There we go. They will be available on the Region 7 webpage at the link you see here. So again, today we're really just going to be walking through as many of your questions as we have. I have prepared, with the help of my team, some reminders and some frequently asked questions to walk through in case you don't have any questions, but really this is an informal presentation today, and it's really about you, the applicants, and any last minute or almost last minute questions that you would like to get addressed. If you've been paying attention, you will know that Region 7 has presented a series of webinars to help you, the applicants, get a better understanding of this year's competition and the competition guidelines. If you are paying attention, then you will have noticed that we've gone through some information about what you need to submit, what some of the differences are from previous applications. We've walked through the assessment, the cleanup, and the RLF guidelines. The purposes of Region 7's applications is, in fact, to highlight for you, not Region 7 applications, Region 7's webinars is to highlight for you the evaluation criteria. In a few slides at the end of this presentation, we will share with you the headquarters presentations, which focused on the information you need to submit and the narrative ranking criteria, which is the section of the guidelines that tells you what questions we have for you, what you need to tell us about in your narrative that is going to be scored. The Region 7 applications, I keep saying applications, excuse me, I mean webinars. The Region 7 webinars were a little bit more focused on looking at how EPA will be ranking that information you provide in response to the narrative and evaluation criteria. So again, today is going to be more about your questions. We'll have a few more FAQs to go through and just a few reminders on the presentation. Not on the presentation, on the competition guidelines. Boy, I am circling around here. Let's try this. In these presentations, we have prepared several sets of slides. In those slides are materials we hope will be useful to you as you're preparing your applications and if you're successful as you move forward in the Brownfields program. Including in that is the alphabet soup of acronyms that EPA tends to use. So highlighted on this slide are a few of them that have to do with the competition, and hopefully in future years you'll be able to come back to these materials if you get lost in the government ease as we start talking, and I apologize if I do this. I'll try to catch myself in acronyms. I'm going to skip over that slide. That was just a little bit about how we've coded these slides, but if you've been participating with us, you've seen that many times. So what I would like to do now is remind you that the guidelines are the most important resource you have available to you. You need to read those guidelines front to back. This is an outline of everything that is included in those guidelines. And there's an accompanying document called a frequently asked questions guidance. And we will talk about that a little bit more as we get into this. What we're talking about, of course, is this year's competition for assessment. We have three types of assessment grants, revolving loan funds, and cleanup grants. And we have three tiers of cleanup grants. So with no further ado now, I'm going to open the floor and look in the chat. Do you all who are participating with you, and I haven't thanked you yet for being here, but I am thrilled you are on here because this means you are interested, I think, in this year's competition. Are there any questions that you all have that you need us to provide clarification on while we're on this call? And I'm just going to pause here, let you unmute yourselves because we've had to mute a few of you. And if you want to raise your hands, let us know. Okay, not seeing anything, we'll move forward. If you come up with a question as we move forward to this presentation, raise your hand. I will remind you that we can continue to talk about threshold criteria offline if you have questions about how to demonstrate that you have satisfied those criteria, what materials you would need, or whether or not, for example, if you're applying for a cleanup grant, that your cleanup ownership will satisfy that. So please feel free to continue to send Tara your questions on threshold. If we haven't gotten back to you, please double check with us, but we are trying to get through those as quickly as we can, although sometimes we do have to work with headquarters to consult on them. So as I mentioned, I do have a few slides and reminders I just want to walk through here. Some of you online are very experienced with our competitions, so you know these timelines and some of this information I'm going to walk through. But as a reminder, your applications are due in grants.gov on November 14th, no later than 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time, so 10:59 p.m. our time. Keep that in mind, and I really can't stress enough that you should not wait till November 14th to submit your application, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second here. If you're wondering about when you would get your funding and when you would be able to start work under a grant, if you're successful and selected to receive one, we make that announcement in late May, and we work with you between May and September to perfect a work plan and make sure all the paperwork and all our T's are crossed and I's are dotted. And then usually you are able to start work under your grant either late September or early October, which is again when we about start the next competition cycle. So it's about a year-long process to get through submittal to selection. Your applications are due in grants.gov. I want to remind you that we have provided a tip sheet on our website, and I'm going to walk through a couple of quick reminders here. We do want you to be cognizant of and fully aware that EPA cannot help you with your grants.gov submittal. There is a very helpful help desk. Say that again. You need to contact the grants.gov help desk if you are having difficulty with your submittals. So I highly recommend you get a case number from them if you run into an issue, that you take screenshots that show the time and the date of whatever it is you're trying to do and having difficulty with it. We are aware that there's going to be a little bit of downtime coming up, and I will walk through what those times here are in a minute. That I think next week they're going to have some downtime, and I will remind you that if you plan to submit your application on November 14th, you are unlikely to have time to go through the whole process of getting help if you need it. So that's one of the reasons we highly encourage you to apply in advance of the deadline. I think I have a couple more slides here. By now, you should have made sure that your organization has a current SAM.gov account. What I mean by that is those have to be renewed periodically, and you want to make sure that you have a account for your organization, the applicant organization, that is still current as of today or through November 14th. It must be current on the day on the day all submittals are due. You need to make sure, and these are all tips because we've run into people having difficulty with this in the past. You want to make sure everything aligns so that your unique entity identifier, which you get on SAM.gov, your number that identifies you in the federal system, your organization's letterhead, on your application form, the name of your organization that's applying, all of those things must align. So please be sure that the sam.gov account is current, all the different ways you're identifying your organization align so that we don't have any questions about who is applying and that you're eligible and are able to submit this through the system. Final reminder on this slide is that you must have your organization's authorized organization representative, AOR, there's one of those acronyms, your representative available for you to submit the document. Some of you may be that for your organization, but some of you are not. So I highly recommend you make sure that that person will be available on the date you need to submit these applications, because that's who has to actually submit the information in grants.gov. So there is a technical assistance center available to you that can also help you with sam.gov. We've provided that information on this slide. Again, we have a tip sheet on how to get your submittals in. And if you run into difficulty, again, be sure to get a case ID and to be working with that help desk at grants.gov to make sure that if there is a problem, EPA then will be able to confirm it with grants.gov and accept your application. We can't make that determination on our own. We need to make sure you have worked through that. Now, I will also remind you that you will get a confirmation from grants.gov, or I shouldn't say you will, your authorized organization representative will receive a confirmation that the application has been successfully submitted. When you get that, that is when you know your application is running through the system correctly. If you do not receive that, you may have an issue and you may need to follow up. So the AOR needs to have time to receive that application and for you to do any follow-up if there is a problem. There's 2 emails that you will receive. It's that second email that is the important one. That's why, again, we recommend highly you work on getting your application submitted before that due date so that you can get the confirmation, or your AOR can get that confirmation back that your application was successfully submitted. Now, I mentioned there is some maintenance coming up, just so you can be aware. That system, the grants.gov system, will be offline coming up on Saturday 19th through the 21st. And I want to make sure that you are aware that I think that's the grants.gov one and not the SAM one, but either way, one of those systems will be offline. So I don't know that you'd be trying to submit your application this soon, but if you are in sam.gov, you might be trying to get your renewal going. Keep in mind that can take a couple of weeks and you want to be working ahead of time. So this week, if that is necessary. Your application, several of you have done this before, so you know what's coming, but you have several documents that are required in grants.gov, and you will complete these in grants.gov in your application form. Those include several federal forms, the SF-424, the SF-424A. So the first one is your application form. The second one is your budget form. Just as a little tip, that budget form should match the budget that you're presenting in your narrative that we will be evaluating. You need to have a key contacts form. I will tell you that EPA headquarters has provided an example for you on how to fill out these forms. I do recommend you look at that because there's some key things in there that are checked the correct way, so that if you you may want to update yourself on what needs to go in those forms, and those are available to you again on our national website. If you have any questions on that, please go ahead and get a hold of us. But I think I've hit the main tips. Everything needs to align, it needs to match, and you need to have a current accounts and know who your AOR is so they can submit that form. So with all of that said, I want to make sure I double check and I've used the right words. The email that your AOR should be looking for is that your application has been validated. So there's going to be an application that says that they received your application from grants.gov. And then there should be a second email that comes through and says that application has been validated. That has to be done by November 14th. So be sure, or it has to be done. It doesn't have to be done by November 14th, but if you submit your application on November 14th at 9 o'clock in the evening, you will not have that email come back to your system in time. So if your application cannot be validated in the system, you won't have a chance to fix that. I've stressed this many times. It's really important. We've had applicants who have put their, all that effort into preparing an application and then gotten tripped up at the step of actually submitting it through grants.gov. So think it ahead, be sure you're getting it in on time, and we will give you as much assistance as we can, but the help desk for grants.gov is who you want to contact. Now, I will remind you, you do not have to submit a formal work plan. Those of you who work with EPA in the past or with other organizations know there's a document that goes with your grant award that would include the work that would be conducted. The application you're submitting now will include a narrative discussion. We'll describe that, but you do not have to submit a formal work plan. All right, I'm moving ahead. Please raise your hand if you have any questions as I'm going through. A few more recommendations on preparing your application. Again, read those guidelines. It walks you through all the information we need. It lays it out, numbers it. Have somebody else double check your application and when you're done to make sure it's all there. Headquarters put together several webinars and some pre-recorded information. There's a pre-recorded, I'm going to call it a webinar there, but there's a recording for each type of application, whether it's assessment, whether it's cleanup, whether it's RLF, and what the minimum requirements are and the threshold requirements are, and how to submit your application. Those are available on our website. If you have not watched one of those, or the one that's relevant to your application, I highly recommend it. It's going to go through everything I've just been saying in a lot more detail, and you can fast forward through it to the information you were looking for. But again, if you have questions after reading the guidelines or looking at the frequently asked questions, those are your next go-to, are these webinars that have been posted. There are also webinars that have been conducted for the ranking evaluation criteria, and that is also about what you have to provide. That is about the narrative you will be writing. So there are a couple of those webinars that were offered publicly and have been posted on headquarters webpage. So those links will be at the end of this guidelines, and I think we've been popping some of them into the chat for your use. I keep saying guidelines when I mean webinars. I apologize. I hope you know what I'm thinking and what I mean. So I keep doing that. I'll try to catch myself. So last minute tips. Respond to each criterion in the narrative guidelines and in the threshold guidelines. So there's a series of questions or information we're asking for you in threshold, which is the information that's going to demonstrate you're eligible and you've done all the pre-application work that needs to happen. Answer those in order. Do not skip them. Write them out, even if you think the answers are obvious. So I highly recommend that you number them, and I'll get onto that in another slide, and that you address each criterion. So even if you are the state and you are applying for a community-wide assessment grant for tribes and states, and the first question is what kind of organization you are, how are you eligible, go ahead and say, number one, I'm a state. So, it will seem obvious, but the more clear you can be that you've addressed each criterion, the better off we're going to be. Respond to the criterion order. That's what I mean by where they're asked. When we get into the actual ranking criteria and how that is going to be evaluated or scored, if you've provided information in order in the correct section, that information will be fully considered. If you do not clearly address a criterion or a sub-criterion, and there's sub-criterions, if you don't clearly address it, and your reviewer has to look for that information somewhere else in the application, then keep in mind you may not be as favorably reviewed. or it may be missed. So it's important to number your criteria. You don't have to give this full title of the criterion or the sub-criterion. You can include some sort of shorthand, but be sure your responses are laid out in that order. I can't stress that enough because you want to be able to achieve all the points you can in this application. These are highly competitive competitions, and every single point counts. We don't want you to miss any because one of the reviewers can't find the information that you know you included, but it's somewhere else in your narrative. Check your written narrative. Hopefully you'll be able to get that prepared in enough time to have at least another person, a fresh set of eyes, look at them and compare them to not only the ranking criteria narrative section that you have to write out in section 4D, but also section 5E, which is the answers. It's the what EPA will be using, how we will score each of your responses. So it's helpful to have somebody read those and check what you've written to make sure it's obvious how you are what information you are providing that will match what EPA is looking for in that scoring. So while one section says provide all of this, then the reviewers have to interpret what you put and say, okay, well, you answered the question to a high degree of certainty and provided enough information so that according to this criteria, I can give you full points. I tried to cover all of that in our previous webinars. Please take a look at those if I'm confusing you. But I can't stress enough. Answer the questions in order, have somebody look at this, have another reviewer try to evaluate your proposal, your narrative, and score it to see how well it can come out and fare with the EPA reviewers. Now, if you're an unsuccessful applicant, if you've gone through all this effort and at the end of the day, unfortunately, you may have a very good application. It may be even highly received by EPA, but we don't have enough funding for it. Or you may have missed a point or two. When we are done with the competition and we've made the announcements of those who have been selected, we will offer you the opportunity for a debriefing on your application. I'm going to go ahead here. I hope you are all successful. But if for some reason you are not, I'm going to go ahead here and ask you to take advantage of that debriefing, because that is when we can tell you how the reviewers reviewed your response, how they viewed the information you provided against those evaluation criteria. Hopefully that will help in the future, but I will remind you that we do receive a number of high quality, good projects, and we just do not have enough funding for all of them. But hopefully we can provide some insight about how the reviewers think, and if you apply the following year or in a future year, that can help you with your application. Again, I'm hoping everybody that's on the line here today will succeed and you don't have to worry about that, but I want to go ahead and put that plug in now so you understand what it is we're offering at the time we make the announcements of who's been selected. I've talked a lot about criteria section 5. I want to remind you that is the section that talks about the scoring. How many points each answer you've provided or each discussion you've provided is worth. How that is divided up into sub-criterion and sub-sub-criterion. I can't stress enough because I think we've received a lot of applications where no one has looked at it from that standpoint. No one has looked to see, okay, you know, I said this and it should give me this many points. That's important to look at so that you are aware of this. And again, I've probably belabored this too much, but make sure that someone is taking a look at it that way. So what's helpful? When you submit your application, organize it. There are several things that are required. A narrative information sheet. There are attachments to the narrative information sheet, including a letter from your state authority if it's an assessment grant or a RLF grant. There is threshold criteria that I've talked about. Those are the pass-fail things. Are you an eligible entity? Is the property you're talking about eligible? Have you done all the pre-application notification or other activities that must occur so that you can be eligible in this competition. That's your threshold criteria. And that is actually an attachment to your entire document, and it does not have a page limitation. If you are an entity other than a city, a state, a county, or a very clear subdivision of the state, we may be asking you to submit documentation of your eligibility, especially if you are a nonprofit. There are certain types of nonprofits that are eligible for our grants. There are some other types of organizations that are eligible that we would call quasi-governmental, but they are authorized by state or local government. And we want you to make sure you document that organization, the applicant's organization, or your coalition members' organization's eligibility by attaching that information to the threshold criterion. We are allowed to come back to you with clarifying questions on threshold. But if you haven't attached the information that's necessary up front to demonstrate the eligibility of your application, or if you are applying for a cleanup grant to demonstrate resources you have secured for that grant, we can't come back and get that information for you. So from you, all we can do is get some clarifying answers. So do not skip any of the threshold criterion. Be sure you have all the required attachments with the document. Couple of clarifying points here as we're talking about threshold. If you are applying for a cleanup grant, I don't care any of the 3 levels, there's a document called the Analysis for Brownfield's Cleanup Alternatives that is a required attachment. It has to be at least a draft of that. There are some other community notification requirements that you have to demonstrate that you've notified your community in time, soon enough for them to have an opportunity to comment on this draft application and your APCA, and you will provide a demonstration of that. Those attachments are required. If they are not present, you will fail threshold, and we don't want that to happen. If you've made them available, if there's a demonstration of how you've made information available on your website, include a link in that threshold criteria and explain what you made available that way and when, and demonstrate when you did that if there's a deadline. Those are all critical components for cleanup grants. I do want to suggest you not include any extraneous information. If you have a well-developed APCA that has all the phase 1s, phase 2s, and other information that went into creating that summary document, Analysis of Brownfield's Cleanup Alternatives describes a little bit about the site. It describes what the cleanup alternatives were looked at, how those were evaluated against several criteria, and oftentimes they include a large number of attachments. Do not include all those attachments. That is, we're not scoring your analysis of Brownfield's cleanup and alternatives. We are looking to make sure you have at least a draft and that was shared with the public. So keep your documents, your PDF size limited by not attaching 100 pages of attachments that aren't going to be reviewed or scored or not necessary. So again, the draft APCA, not necessarily all its attachments, and the documentation demonstrating that you did whatever public notification needed to occur and received and responded to comments. All of that is outlined in the threshold, but do not add extra attachments that are not required or not allowed. They won't be reviewed and they won't help support your case. And it just makes your document bulky and difficult to move through it as a PDF. So I don't know that I had enumerated or went through that in that degree of specificity previously, but I wanted to remind you of that. If you're applying for an RLF, there's also a legal letter that is required to demonstrate your authority to conduct these activities. So be sure that is an attachment. So identify your attachments, make sure they're all included in one PDF if possible. And again, make sure you don't include anything extraneous. There is a checklist in section 4C that just briefly goes through the information that should be included in that submittal. Your narrative information sheet, which is limited to 3 sheets, 3 pages, and everything that goes in there. The attachments to that. Your narrative description, the attachments to that. So it walks you through all of the things that are eligible, and it references other places in the guidelines where it goes into more detail. Your application, if you are applying for a assessment coalition, a community-wide grant for states and tribes, that's an assessment grant, or a revolving loan fund grant, those are limited at 12 pages for your narrative. For the part that your national panel would review and score is that 12 pages. They're not going to be looking at your threshold criterion. They're not going to be looking at the narrative information sheet or applying a score to that sheet. So make sure any information you need is in that 12 pages that you need them to consider in applying a score to each of the ranking criteria or evaluation criteria. If you're applying for a community-wide assessment or a cleanup grant, you're limited to 10 pages. So again, that's a challenge, and we understand that because we have a lot of criterion and subcriterion, many of which are required by our authorizing statute and by our grants offices to make sure that you will have the capacity to manage these grants, and by the necessity to demonstrate we are putting at least 40% of the federal resources in communities that have been disadvantaged or historically underrepresented or economically challenged as part of the Justice 40 initiative. So there are several criteria that you will be responding to. Be aware there's a reason for every question we ask. We've applied points, and again, that's the information that's available to you in Section 5 to help you understand how each of those questions will affect your score. Finally, readability is critical. Not because that is, what do I mean by readability? First of all, what I mean is if your page has so much information on it that you've narrowed your spacing, you've widened your margins, you've used a font that crunches everything together so that the information is so dense, I just want to remind you, when you do that, yes, you might stay within your page limitations, but you've made it that much harder for your reviewers to pick out the key information they need to give you as many points as possible. So reader fatigue is a real thing for evaluators. Our evaluators are extremely, what's the word I want? They're going to do everything they can to find the information that you've provided. You've gone to the effort to put this together. We all understand, those of us who evaluate these, how much work that is. But we also want to make sure that you are kind to your reviewers so they can find the information you need quickly and give you the scores that you have earned. So while I say things on this slide like 1-inch margins, 12-point fonts, we have specific fonts we suggest because those are very readable. I would also mention that you can do some things in your application that will make your information even more readily available. If it's data you're presenting, is it easier to present it in a table or in a narrative? If it is it easier to read? If you have the opportunity to highlight a few things by bolding it judiciously or underlining judiciously, you may want to do that, but I will remind you, you don't want to have a whole document that's bolded or a whole document that's underlined. But you can use those things to identify what's unique about your community, and those things you want to really call the reviewer's attention to that tell your story, that demonstrate the situation you're in, or how you plan to respond to that situation, what you think your outcomes will be, what your community engagement has been, those key points. There are several tables that are offered in the guidelines as potential templates. That's one way to present the information. Recommend it if it fits your needs. If you want to deviate from that, that's allowable. Just make sure it's just as easy for your evaluators to find the information they're looking for if you don't use those that are provided in the guidelines. Couple more reminders. Last year or the year before, I don't remember which, we went to requiring a different type of letter from your state or tribal environmental authority for cleanup grants than we do for multipurpose and assessment grants. If you are applying for, we're not doing multi-purpose this year, but if you are applying for an assessment grant or an RLF grant, a revolving loan fund grant, you will need a letter from your state or tribal environmental authority that says they acknowledge the work that you are planning to do. They know you're submitting for these grant activities. That has to be an attachment to your application. It must be for the current year, and it must not be sent separately from your application. So you don't want to send it in to the administrator. You don't want to send it into the regional administrator. You don't want to send it to Tara or to me. You want to make sure it is attached to your application. If it is not there, that can be an issue with whether your application can move forward in scoring. So keep that in mind. That is a requirement. And be sure to contact your state and environmental or tribal authority early enough that you can get that in a timely manner. If you're having trouble with that, please reach out to us as well here. Cleanup grant applications, however, require a different kind of letter. We used to require that acknowledgement letter. Now what we actually require is acknowledgement from your environmental authorities at the state or tribal level that there is sufficient information known about the site characterization for the sites you're going to clean up to allow you to move forward quickly into cleanup. So what do we mean by that? You need to know that the site is contaminated. You need to know how much contamination is there so that you can prepare reasonable cleanup alternatives that you'll have put in your analysis of Brownfield's cleanup alternatives document, the ABCA, and that once you are selected and once you receive that funding next fall, you will be able to move quickly into cleanup without a whole lot of time and effort having to go into additional information gathering. So what we're at, or environmental data gathering, more sampling, more what we like to call the extent and I had a term there and I just lost it, but basically to demonstrate how much contamination is present and how much contamination you're going to be able to remove or you're going to be addressing through engineering controls or with institutional controls. So that letter must come from your state organization to say that they agree with you or your environmental professional that you have that level of data ready. If you don't have it at the time of application on November 14th, there needs to be acknowledgement that they believe you will have it by June 15th. And that is for sites that will be enrolling with the state voluntary cleanup program. Now, if you are a state applying for a cleanup or a tribe applying for a cleanup, these do not apply to you, but everybody else it does. So you have to have a letter, a current letter that says there's sufficient investigation done at the site, sufficient characterization that the cleanup will be able to proceed. What if that site is not eligible for enrollment in a state or tribal voluntary cleanup program? We also call those response programs for oversight, where they will be overseeing the work to be done. And at the end of the day, it will be the state or the tribe that's saying that your cleanup was done correctly and that it was protective of human health and the environment. Well, if you have a type of site that is not eligible for enrollment, you want the state to acknowledge that in their letter, and you may have to supplement your documentation with information demonstrating that you have a qualified environmental professional who has said you have enough information data done. Why are we going into this effort? We added this a couple of years ago because when we award these funds, they need to be used in a timely fashion within the period of performance that you are given with the grant application. With the grant award, you need to be able to go through any planning that needs to be done, any community engagement that needs to be done, and the entirety of the cleanup. So it's important to recognize that timeline, and we added this to make sure that there was some reasonable level of assurance that you can provide EPA that you are ready for the cleanup. So if you've not reached out to your state or tribal environmental authority at this point, when we're done with today's call, please reach out to them so you can make sure you have your letter in time and that they have the information they need, especially if you're applying for cleanup, to draw the conclusions we're asking them to draw on your behalf. Now, You only have to include one letter for all the proposed activity if you're applying for multiple types of grants. So if you are applying for an assessment and a cleanup grant, or an RLF grant, and you're applying for an assessment grant, then you only have to include one type of letter. The state can write you one letter, but you have to attach it to each of the relevant applications. So again, cleanup is asking for a kind of a different question. It's asking a different question, but you can still have a letter from the state that addresses what we need for assessment and we need for cleanup, and have it attached to both documents if that is what works best for you and your state authority. Just make sure at the end of the day those are attached. We can't receive those after the application due date. Finally, what I want to mention about all of this is that I lost my train of thought. Excuse me. If for some reason you are having difficulty attaining that letter and you've contacted them early enough, please reach out to Tara and I, and we will see what we can do to make sure you get the support you need. But all 4 states that we work with have been, I think, pretty timely on getting those types of letters to you as applicants so that you can include them in your application. Just be sure not to use one from a previous year. Make sure you have the right letter type attached to the right application, especially if you're submitting multiple applications. All right. Another tip. In your guidelines, there's a document called the Other Factors document. This is not scored. This is not ranked. This is not information that gets evaluated by the reviewers. But the importance of this in your narrative information sheet is that if for some reason, at the end of the day, our decision official has selected a certain number of projects that were highly ranked, so those that got X number of points, then the next lowest level of points, and the next level of points, and when we add up all the funding that's involved, we have a little bit of funding left for that type of grant. So maybe we've selected 30 assessment grants, but we have a little bit of money left where we could award 2 or 3 more assessment grants. Well, rather than not award that funding, there's a process called the other factors that the selection official can use. They are provided information about how every application in the next levels of scores. So it might be the next grouping of scores where there might be, say, we've selected 30 of highly ranked, and then we have another 20 really good proposals, and they're within a point or two each other below that cutoff for those that were selected. The decision official will use these other factors after being provided information about how they impact every one of the applications in that next tier to do what I call a tie break. If we don't have enough funding to award to everybody in that tier, and we only have enough for a few applications, then the decision official will look at the balance of how the previous applications address these kind of factors and who within this tie-breaking tier meets different criteria in here. And they'll use that to select a few more applications. This is pretty critical. So what we ask you to do is indicate if any of these factors apply to you and where in your application you have noted that it's applicable, so that we can double check the information you have provided is specific. So if you are submitting I don't know that these are all the current ones, because I'm looking at this and I'm thinking one of these is not applicable. But if you are submitting something that is addressing a community with a coal-fired power plant, you would indicate on here the page number where you've discussed that. And then if we came down to that final selection, and the decision official, who is the assistant administrator of the Office of Land and Emergency Management in headquarters, if they choose then to say, oh, look, we could award 2 more and in this next tier because they're doing this, then you would be considered for that. Okay, I've stressed that a lot. But we've had people who have forgotten to include this information who missed out on being awarded because they did not include it and it was applicable to them. So don't skip the other factors. I've gone on that longer than I probably need to. I've already touched on not including attachments that are not applicable and being sure you address every threshold criterion. These are, there's, like I said, there's sub-criterion here too. There is no page limitation to your threshold responses. The only reason I suggested you not include extraneous information like that gets attached to the ABCA is just a size limitation on an electronic file. But if you think you need to attach more information to demonstrate what you're telling us in your threshold responses, then again, there's no limitation here. That information is not going to be scored. So a note again on those analysis of brownfields cleanup alternatives or ABCAs. There's a lot of information that often gets provided in those. It's good information, but your reviewers who are providing scores are not going to see that information. So it's important that you repeat any key information from there that addresses any of the ranking criteria in your narrative response. That's all I'm going to say there, but I think it's important for you to be aware of that. I'm going to go into some key frequently asked questions, but I want to, before we go there, I want to pause to see if any of you have come up with any questions yet. And I don't see any yet. So I'm just going to keep charging ahead. Another reminder is that this year, for the first time, I've been in EPA and the Brownfields program for a long time, and it has been since the earliest days of this program. We have not allowed maps as an attachment to your application. This year, it's optional, but you are allowed to provide a map that shows the target area and you can show the target area or your target priority sites, or a combination of those two, and it's optional. It's a one-page document you can attach to your application. Why are we doing that if it's optional? Well, a picture's worth 1,000 words sometimes. Your map is not going to be scored, but if it helps set the context for everything you're describing to us in your writing, it can be a useful document. So if you don't know or unaware of where you could download a map and demonstrate where your outlines are for your target area, where your priority sites are, that is something that you can use some of the tools EPA has available, such as the Environmental Justice Screening Tool. And there are also other free tools out there that'll allow you to generate and download a PDF of a map where you've put these spots on them. You know, you have the outline of your target area or the census tracts that you're addressing, and you've identified the addresses in there of the cleanup sites you're proposing, for example. It is something that's available to you. If you have any questions, you can reach out to the Technical Assistance for Brownfields program or your state environmental authority, and they may be able to assist you with figuring out where you can acquire such a map. So it's not something you necessarily have to pay a consultant for, but if you don't have within your organization that kind of geographic mapping assistance, you should be able to find some free assistance out there. Again, it's an optional attachment, but as someone who likes to have the context set for you, I can say it might be useful to your reviewers. What it does is it can just sort of speed up their understanding of what you're writing. Now, no photographs are allowed. You can't add any additional information to that map other than the few things I just discussed that can be presented on it. So don't try to sneak in additional data to your reviewers to make them aware of something. Don't include any links or to maps or to other materials, because your reviewers can't review anything that is not included in the narrative or in these allowed attachments. Enough said. Does anybody have any questions about the maps? And again, it's evaluated. It in of itself does not get scored, just like the budget table in and of itself does not get scored, but it is a tool to summarize or demonstrate the information that you're going to describe in your description of your budget. Well, it's the same thing for a map. It's going to help summarize some of the information you're going to provide, particularly in response to the first section of the narrative criteria, where we've asked you to describe your priority sites, your target areas. If you are a revolving loan fund, your geographic jurisdiction that you are identifying for your program. And then you're going to go on and talk about those things in more detail, but the map can help set that context. So that's an allowable attachment, 1 page, new this year. Can't emphasize it enough, but hopefully that will be a useful tool for you to provide your reviewers. Okay. I'm just rolling in. Where is a map attached and will scoring reviewers see it? Yes, Andrew, scoring reviewers will see it. I would attach it to the narrative information sheet. They do get the narrative information sheet. They don't score that information. So if the narrative information sheet includes information that you have not repeated in the narrative, then they can't give you points, if you will, for that information, but they will see that information. It's the threshold review, the threshold information they won't likely see or look at. So the map will be attached up front with your narrative information sheet, and it will be something that will not be redacted. Reviewers will be able to have access to it in the PDF. So thank you. Hey, a question. Thank you, Andy. I keep moving on. All right, I keep mentioning the frequently asked questions document. There is a document that EPA posts every year for each application competition, and we keep last year's up and this year's. It's called the frequently asked questions document. We build on this document throughout the year. It's designed for the competition, so a lot of your threshold questions or what does this word mean, things that might not be clear in the guidelines, we've elaborated on in our frequently asked questions. So again, it's a document I highly recommend you should look at. And by the way, if you are successful in receiving a grant, I suggest you keep a copy of that document because it's going to also answer a lot of the questions for you as you go forward and write work plans and implement your grants. So the following several slides are just going to highlight a few of these FAQs that we've run into that have been helpful to people or where we've gotten questions on. So moving ahead, eligible entities. It is a bit grant specific. So if you are applying for an assessment agreement, an RLF agreement, those are RLF standing for revolving loan fund. That is one set of eligible entities. If you're applying for a cleanup grant, there are a few more eligible entities. So what do I mean by that? If you are a land bank who is applying, it will matter if you are an agency or instrumentality of the state versus an independent nonprofit. It will matter how you apply under that determination. So what your status of your organization is will impact how you are demonstrating your eligibility. Note on whether or not you're an agency or instrumentality of the state. It's also important to know that if you are an agency or instrumentality of another eligible entity besides a state, for example, a city, and you are a land bank, and you are actually so closely aligned with or controlled by, and so are actually a part of that city, for example, you may not be eligible to apply for a new grant if that city or eligibility has the same type of grant and hasn't met the basic thresholds. So we've run into this in the past with a couple of organizations where the land bank has been actually determined to be a part of the city and not a separate nonprofit organization or a separate organization because of the degree of control and funding that comes from that city. So if you're in that kind of situation, please follow up with us so we can make sure you are applying the right way and in fact are eligible. Now, if that organization that you're an instrumentality of doesn't have a grant, then that's not an issue. But if you look through the threshold guidelines, you will see there are some places where we'll say something like that if you have an existing grant of that type, you'll have to have drawn 70% of your funding. So that's when it can come into importance. We can walk through with you on this on threshold, even before you apply, to help you determine how you're eligible. Now let's talk a little bit about nonprofits. A 50C6 organization can apply for a cleanup grant. A 501c4 organization that does not lobby, that you can demonstrate you do not lobby the federal government, can apply. So what this last bullet says is a 50C4 organization under the IRS code that is the type of nonprofit that lobbies the federal government. Those are not eligible. But if you can demonstrate to us in your threshold criterion by including a statement that indicates that while you are a 50C4 organization under the IRS, and you can demonstrate that, you do, and then indicate and include a statement that you do not lobby the federal government, then we can take a look at you being eligible. If you are a 501c3 organization type of nonprofit, and you do lobby the government, then you won't be eligible there if that's where your tax exempt status is coming from. So basically, the key thing here for nonprofits is you cannot lobby the federal government. You cannot receive our funding if you lobby the federal government. There's also a type of organization called a community development entity. I'm trying to think of the code that applies to. It's like 45C1 or D1. Those are also eligible entities, and there's a lot more information about that in the actual FAQs as well as the guidelines themselves. So if you are a non-city, non-clear subdivision of the state, it's like a county, a city, and you aren't sure how to demonstrate your eligibility, read the guidelines, read the FAQs, and please reach out to Tara Vaughn, who's with us today, who serves as our competition coordinator for this year, so that we can make sure you get the correct documentation attached and information attached to your application to demonstrate your eligibility. All right, are there any questions on that? I'm just going to keep moving forward. If not, I think most people that I saw online today are associated with actually a governmental entity that's clearly a governmental entity. So what do we expect to happen if you are selected to receive funding? This is, again, another one of our FAQs, and you have to identify additional sites. So we're not talking about cleanup applications, where cleanup applications, you come into us with the sites that you plan to clean up to demonstrate that you own them and that they are eligible. You're not going to be able to add additional sites there. But if you are applying for assessment or a revolving loan fund grant, then you are going to likely not have all your sites picked out. So you're going to have to identify additional sites. One of our criterion, or one of the things you're going to be scored on, is that you have included in your prioritization criteria for selecting different sites that a site is located in an underserved community. Doesn't have to be the only criterion, but it needs to be demonstrated. That is one of the things you are considering. So one of the things we've identified in the FAQs is what we mean by an underserved community. Generally, what we are talking about is looking at how whether or not it is a underserved community as defined by the CJEST tool, which I'm going to forget. It's CJEST, and I'm going to forget what that acronym stands for. It's the Community Justice. It's the Community Environmental. I can't remember what it stands for, but we have links to it in this presentation and elsewhere. But as defined in that tool, which is the tool that is used by the White House in demonstrating that the federal government is meeting its Justice 40 goals, that at least 40% of our resources are going to communities that are underserved. You're going to be identifying information in the application and in future sites where you're going to be looking at whether sites are within census tracts that pop up and are demonstrated in that tool to be underserved. So just wanted to mention that so that you are paying attention to what that means. There are places in the application where we actually mention that tool, and you're going to want to make sure that you identify as you're addressing those evaluation criteria that in fact you are using that tool itself. And I will come back, or if somebody would type in what CGIS stands for me, I would appreciate that from my team because I'm completely blanking on what that means. But again, it's the White House's tool for identifying disadvantaged or underserved communities. It's probably on these slides. On sensitive populations, underserved, disadvantaged communities, displacement, and environmental justice. These are all things that are important to EPA. In the first section of the guidelines, in fact, there are whole sections that discuss what we mean by environmental justice. What does it mean to be an underserved community? So we've also included information in our frequently asked questions to elaborate on that. So what is the definition of equity? What does it mean when we talk about someone being underserved, or an area census tract that's been underserved or historically underserved or is economically underserved? We've provided that information for you in the FAQs. If you have any questions, whether your census tracts are meeting that, come back and look at these meanings and look for overburdened communities and the types that, thank you, Alice, Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, CGIST. So I wanted to call your attention to that. And look, it's coming up here, I think. I want to call your attention to these FAQs because I think they're important when you are going through your evaluation, the ranking and narrative information, so you know what you are referring to. We are asking you for specific census tract information this year. So this is one place where you will get that information is the CGIS tool, which is defined on this slide. So again, I suggest you look at the frequently asked questions if you need to get additional information on there. Another thing that comes up a lot of times is we ask you in the guidelines about your sensitive populations, which is defined in the FAQs, by the way. We ask you about risks and stressors. So our FAQs do help you understand the difference by what we mean, so that I want you to call your attention to this. So as you're writing your narrative, you have an opportunity to make sure you're using the terms correctly and responding to the information that is required. So a risk is the chance of a harmful effect from something that is resulting from the exposure to something in the environment that is a stressor. So that could be any physical, chemical, or biological entity that can induce an adverse response. I think most of us are aware by this time that there are things that can promote asthma. There's a stressor and what is the chance of you being exposed to those things that create that stressor to increase the chances of asthma? That is the risk. So keep those terms in mind if you are confused. What is a sensitive population? Now, there's actually a formal definition in the Superfund statute, the CERCLA statute, that defines a sensitive population as children, pregnant women, minority or low-income communities, or other sensitive populations. We have a specific ranking criteria that asks you about sensitive populations and the impact on their health, welfare, and their health or welfare. So this is what we mean. Now, if you're going to go for and use that last bit, or other sensitive population, so you can talk about the health and welfare of your minority and low-income community, but if you're going to add in something else like the elderly, you need to explain why that's a sensitive population. But these others are a given. Children, pregnant women, minority or low income are given sensitive populations because that's included in the definition. Now, there's other factors, and there are other things that can make a population sensitive. But if you include those as part of your response to the ranking criteria, be sure you explain then what those are. And make sure as you're discussing this that it's clear how it's specific to your community. So I'm going to leave that go. I just want to call your attention to that frequently asked question. And I'm focusing a lot on environmental, what we at EPA have long-term environmental justice, but is really that historic disenfranchisement and franchisement and underserved populations. One of the questions, and it's newer question, asks you how the implementation of your grant is going to advance environmental justice principles, and at least, and what we mean by that is overcome what some of those disproportionate and adverse impacts to these communities have been in the past. So again, there's some definitional information available to you in the FAQs. It's a newer question, so make sure you're paying attention to it when you get to that section of the guidelines, which is in the community needs section. We provide some examples of things that could impact. These are just examples. You want to make sure if you use these examples, you're explaining how they are specific to your community, because you want to write your narrative to demonstrate that you're talking about your community and this is why you are unique and this stands out. I'm not going to spend any more time on that. I just want to make sure you're aware of that. Here are some of those examples. We have some fact sheets out there too that can talk about some of these things. This is the community needs section where we have several sub-criteria and sub-criteria, as I call them, where you're going to describe basically the health and welfare impacts or the impacts on the environment. You're going to talk about the greater incidence of disease. And I'll remind you in that section, you need to make sure you have a statistic or information that specifically addresses cancer, asthma, or birth defects. Be sure you check that definition of birth defects because that doesn't necessarily mean something like stillborns. Be sure you read that because you will be limited on how many points you can accrue if that is not a situation that applies to your community. These are just examples that we've provided in the FAQs. And again, if you have a different scenario you want to present, or you are presenting one of these scenarios, make sure you identify how that is specific to your community. I think I've gone over time, so I just want to stop and make sure we don't have any last minute questions or questions I haven't addressed. If not, I'm just going to keep charging ahead. And I'm going to quickly walk through these others. These next slides just are demonstrations of information that's available in those FAQs. So we do provide examples of socioeconomic impacts. We provide other examples as well. We talk about the factors that may indicate a disproportionate or adverse impact. So when you're looking at those issues and advancing environmental justice principles, we've provided some sample information, examples, but again, that's just to get your thought process moving around what it is we're thinking about, not that these are necessarily applicable to your community. Make sure anything you respond with is applicable. We talk about scenarios that might result in unanticipated displacement. This is a new part of the subcriteria, so I want to call your attention to this FAQ C16. Be sure to read it as you are writing that portion of your response to the narratives, because displacement is something, if you're not aware of, that's when you come in, you revitalize an area, and in the process, you are moving the people that are there right now that were impacted by the brownfields end up being unable to live in that new community you built. So we have a question that asks you to address the unintended consequences of displacement. Andrew, I see you have come off on the camera. Did you have a specific question? Oh, okay, thank you. Another thing we ask you about is local climate adaptation and mitigation and capacity and resilience. There's some questions that specifically get at climate adaptation and mitigation. And also, if you're applying for a cleanup grant, this is something that will be part of your ABGA. So we do go through, what does that mean? What does that mean for your community? And again, I'm going to slide through these quickly. These are all examples of where climate could be impacting your community, or how the work you're going to do could have a positive outcome when we're talking about making sure your community is resilient to changes in climate. but also how health and welfare may be impacted by climate issues. So these things can all link together. We provide a lot of definitional information. Here we provide some mapping tools in S6, frequently asked question. If you're looking for data or information to help you in addressing that criterion in your narrative, please look at some of these examples. We talk about, I'm not going to walk through all this. This is all going through more and more of things about what it means to be vulnerable to climate, what it means to be adaptable, what it means to be resilient. We also ask you for your community local partnerships. I'm not going to say community-based, but that's often what we mean. But those local organizations are going to work with you in your grant and help support the success of the work you're going to be doing. We've provided examples of that. We've included a definition for what meaningful involvement means. That is one of the things that is near and dear to EPA's mission, is that as you are working on addressing the brownfields in your community, that you have meaningful engagement with those who are most impacted by the brownfields that you are addressing, or who may be most impacted with the benefits of those, and the other stakeholders that are necessary to get you from, oh, we have a horrible situation here with this brownfields, to, oh, look, we have this great plan for revitalization. It's going to have all these benefits. You need to keep the community engaged along the way. So again, this slide just highlights again a few more of those types of questions. The whole point of all this was just to demonstrate there's a lot of information out there that can answer your questions and illuminate what we are asking how you to tell us about your community and how these things impact your community as you're writing your narrative. If you have a question about the sites you're suggesting for your cleanup, please bring those into us. You do not have to demonstrate, as in the past, that you have petroleum sites or hazardous substance sites. You can have sites that have petroleum contamination or hazardous substance sites. You do not have to distinguish them like we used to, and that was a result of funding. I'm going to just charge ahead to these last few slides, which were just these resources. This is a repeat of materials that have been in the previous presentations. As I said, there's a large amount of resource out there. If you are not already working with the Tab EZ program, you may want to take a look at that. That's an online tool to help you writing your narrative, but it also answers and provides examples of a lot of information that can help you in your application. As I said earlier, we will have the slides and materials from the previous webinars that Region 7 has done, as well as the recordings on our website. We've had some difficulty with that. If you would like a copy of the presentation materials from today or any of the previous ones, please email us at r7_brownfields@epa.gov or to Tara Vaughn, whose information is going to be on the next slide, and we will make sure to email you a copy. But we do hope to get that all posted this week. If you have threshold questions, get a hold of us. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for being with us. Sorry I've gone over so much. And just a reminder, we have Brownfields Conference coming up. So that is it for today. If you do have questions between now and November 14th, go ahead and submit them to Tara. If we can answer them, we will. If not, we will suggest resources you can go to get assistance with them. Thank you.